On today's episode, we talk about how unremarkable Steve Jobs was, why some prioritize supporting the CIA in the name of nonpartisanship, how thoroughly uninteresting Elon Musk is. We ask why we shouldn't take every simple precaution from COVID-19. We discuss a $0 an hour minimum wage, and lastly, hear why we can't cut the military budget at all, or we'll have no army to defend us. This is Cringe Posts. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of the Cringe Posts podcast. This is the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes in your feed, and we break down where they went wrong and try to have a laugh along the way. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder that if you are listening to this show and you want to see these posts, and you're not watching our YouTube or Odyssey channels, go ahead and head to cringeposts.com, and you can find a visual companion there where you can see all of these posts. And also a reminder to like and comment and subscribe. All that jazz really helps us out, and we appreciate it. So before we dive into the bad political takes of others, we always like to make fun of our own bad political or other postings and takes and things like that. And so today we're actually going to sort of talk about a time about Britt here, rather than an individual post. We're just going to kind of recount some of the first time Britt and I ever really talked politics. Britt and I met in college. She was actually the first person I ever met at one of the orientations at college. And this would have been, it would have been our first, I guess the first year when we first kind of talked about stuff, what was going on was the 2012 election. It was still primary season at that time, I believe.
Was it? I think, we talked a little bit then, but then I think where we really, and this is where the cringe comes in, was the 2015 primaries.
That's right.
Or 2015 year for the 2016 primaries for president.
That's right. Yeah, because it ramped up really early. That's right.
Yes.
I was thinking it was too far off, but no, that's the right time.
And there was like 12 candidates or whatever in the field for the GOP. And I remember, I don't know exactly how the conversation started, but I was like, I just really like Ben Carson. Like, I loved Ben Carson. And I think the only reason I liked him was because, like, he's not a politician and he's also black. And so, like, how is the left going to attack him for being, whatever? It's like, how could they call? It's like, okay, dude. Like, obviously, I hadn't really thought through any of this stuff. And I was pretty underdeveloped in, like, my political principle, right? Of, like, I didn't actually have a principle other than if I think something's right, then we should elect someone to do the thing that I think is right. If they promise they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And you were so gentle with me. I really appreciate it because you're like, oh no, I think Rand Paul would probably be a better choice. And I was like, okay. And I think you even had because you were signed up for something, you had a Ben Carson sticker or something. I can't. Yeah. And you gave it to me, and I was like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I had. Sort of, I think that maybe was my senior year or something like that. But I had the idea to maybe start a college Republicans group at one point, and I hadn't gone through with it. I'd been in contact with them, but that was really, my first or second. Yeah, I think my first year of college was really when I started disassociating. I still called myself a Republican, but I was like, well, I'm more of a Rand Paul Republican. Most people kind of got the red pill from Ron Paul. I actually got it from Rand Paul. Even as, now you look back on the campaign and it wasn't as libertarian as you'd want. And I understand why that it didn't spark the revolution that they wanted. Even still at the time, it was perfect for me, who was just coming out of that really traditional Republican thinking. And so Rand Paul was more and more influencing me. So I sort of had the idea to start a college Republicans group. I talked to some of their organizers. I didn't. For some reason, they sent me, this was like 2 or 3 years later, they sent me this box of Run Ben Run merch.
Yes.
It was like, I just had this box of these stickers and I think koozies that all said Run Ben Run on them. And I'm like, what am I going to do with a box of these?
That idiot down the way from my room. I'll just give them to him.
Yeah. Well, I gave you one. I didn't give you the whole box.
Yes, just one. But I had that sticker on our door. And
yeah. But I mean, it's funny because I think a lot of times one of the problems I had in the original not the original, but the 2012 Ron Paul movement, when I really came to interact with Ron Paul people, it was a big wake-up moment for a lot of people. But for me, I was not fully developed at that time. And the problem was people were so, like, if you were on the Ron Paul train, if you just thought everyone else was just so wrong. And it felt like everyone I interacted with, and I was young, which is probably the problem, but everyone who I interacted with, it was like, oh, you're a moron if you don't support Ron Paul. Like, how can you think this way, you complete dunce? And so I was totally turned off to the Ron Paul movement, which is a dumb
you're being
reason.
contrarian.
But yeah, well, I mean, it's like, if you're being told, like, you're an idiot, of course you're going to double down. Like, no, I'm not. What are you saying? So, it's a stupid reason to. So I always try to not be that way as much as possible. And so, when it comes to like Ben Carson, it's like, yeah, that was me with like Rick Santorum in 2012. I liked him because he espoused these ideas, and I liked him for kind of superficial reasons. Or Mike Huckabee before Rick Santorum. You know what I mean? There's an ever-listing end of people that you admire, and so it's like, yeah, you fell for Ben Carson, but there's still hope.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was a pretty. For me, it was pretty fast, right? Like, we started talking about that. I think you turned me on to the Tom Woods show. I remember I was prepping for tour that summer, and we had about a week or two of like technical prep and rehearsals and stuff. And I remember as I was like programming lights and things, I would listen to the Tom Woods show. This was like my first podcast, and man, it was fast. Like, I was like, oh, this makes tons of sense. Like, you have an underlying principle of non-aggression. Like, I definitely believe that. And then it kind of everything builds from there. And as they say, a minarchist is just 6 months away from being an anarchist. And it was actually more about a year for me, but I came around pretty fast to it. And it's cool, man. I mean, that's why we have this show too, is because I think that like people are really, people kind of get caught in and about with like, well, shoot, like I like this person, I like their policies, but then they do these things that are awful or vice versa. And there's like, they're kind of awash in a sea of different things. It's like, no, like the underlying problem is the fact that someone else has control over your life and everyone else's life at the same time. And once you get that principle, it's pretty cool. And that's kind of our mission, I guess you could say, is to kind of spread that message of liberty and personal freedom. So anyways, you started with me, and I really appreciate you doing that in college, because I'm a better person because of it.
Well, and the other thing I think is like when you look at someone like Ben Carson, often our initial response is like, yeah, that's the person I want in power. And then you realize that either they disappoint you because we're only human and they don't, live up to what they promise, or they can't do what they promise because the system is so bad.
Yes.
So it's like our new alignment of thinking is sort of like, we want to, get rid of these horrible bureaucratic institutions so that virtuous people like Ben Carson can be cultural leaders, right? You're not forced to, but it's like, oh, I like him. He should be able to set an example that people should be able to follow, not by force. And we shouldn't be prevented to either by force.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we are going to move on to our first cringe post here. And, so this was a discussion revolving, it started from abortion, and I'm not even going to touch the abortion debate here because that's not the point of this post. I just thought that this last take was so funny and bad. It kind of sounds like a past Donnie take in cringe levels here. So the first, in this conversation chain, the first one reads, "Conservatives are now trying to end abortion rights. So which party is extreme now?" And then someone else replies, Good abortion must come to an end. Even Steve Jobs was grateful that his parents never aborted him, though they had nothing at the time. Imagine if the guy was aborted. Imagine if you were aborted, this post would not exist." And then someone else replies with this stinker, "I believe someone would just replace Steve Jobs. He wasn't destined to create Apple. Something similar would have popped up. He's not that extraordinary." It's so funny because, I mean, of all of the sort of business and cultural, like, I don't even know if he was necessarily a billionaire. He probably was. But all these business leader types, of anyone to say that he's not extraordinary or that just another one would pop up, I feel like Steve Jobs is the least likely that you could say that about. You could say that and maybe get away with Jeff Bezos. Like, he saw a trend and he capitalized on it, and he had savvy to do so. But, maybe he himself isn't this extraordinary human. Now, you go back and forth on that. But it's like Steve Jobs was a creative genius. I mean, you look at the work he did with Pixar before and all that, and leading up to Apple, it's like, it was not like he just sort of flipped a coin and stumbled into Apple and was really lucky. He had something that many people lack. And so this was just really funny.
Yeah, what a of all the arguments to choose about abortion, like why choose this one? You know, one of one of the most special human beings of the 21st century isn't that extraordinary. And we're gonna have another take very similar to this here in a minute from our friend Joe Walsh. But you know what's hilarious about this is that Steve Jobs was so special that every company since Apple like tries to position themselves like Apple in the market, in that they try to create a product that is like super user oriented, super usable, that it just works. Like that's a very Apple framework of thinking of like, hey, you get a product and it just works. Like we are the iPhone of, you know, whatever industry. Like people use that example all the time because the products that Steve Jobs built were just so well designed and so well, and maybe past Donnie would disagree, you know, with that with that caveat, but they really were in such a way that people wanted to buy them. And if anything, even if someone might have created another like Apple product, obviously other people have created smartphones, right? And MP3 players and all these things. But Steve Jobs single-handedly kind of created that Apple mindset, which is like smooth, sleek, in a nice enclosure, really rich user features. And like that is not an ordinary thing to come around. That's like a really special skill that only a few people have. And it's evidence in that every other company, like I said, wants to copy Apple. And just, I don't know, like, is that like if you're engaging with the fact that like abortion is snuffing out a person's life or something's life, right? Even if you can't grant the premise that you know, an unborn fetus is a person, like I don't know, it just seems like a really weak argument to say, well, let's snuff it out because another one will come along. You know, like you're inherently granting value then to something existing. Why not have more?
It's a super dangerous path to go down because then you're saying, well, he wasn't special, so wiping him out is justified, right? You're saying, and
yes.
then you create a class of like you have to make that value claim and then judge whether or not someone is worthy to have been aborted or not based on the contribution that you.
And if we're measuring against Steve Jobs, we're screwed, all of us.
Yeah,
like with the exception of a few people.
Right, and it's like that. You know, I feel like generally speaking, a more left-wing liberal type dystopian story is the one where the rich elites deem certain people unworthy and then they can die or they get, you know, banished to the outrealm to as good as dead. And it's like, this is kind of where you're going with that by saying, you know, someone would have replaced Steve Jobs. He wasn't that special. Therefore, it's fine. The worst thing is fine, which is just so funny to me. Like, one, just picking a human that is just so not true of by so many different metrics and valuations. And of course, you know, being a Christian myself, I don't think you can make that claim of any human. I think everyone is an individual, unique soul who has value. But regardless, even if you don't hold to that worldview, it's pretty plainly obvious that Steve Jobs has something about him that makes him a little bit standing out from the rest, I'd say. Okay, we're going to move to our next post, and I'm going to give a little bit of context after I read this post just surrounding this. So, yeah, so, well, actually, let me give some context. So, Mike Lee is a Republican senator from Utah, and he is a sort of Republican Liberty Caucus guy, very much of the vein of Rand Paul and formerly Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is still kind of there sometimes, but you know, very libertarian-ish. Not a libertarian, but very libertarian-ish. And people are all up in arms and upset because initially he had been texting with the chief of staff of the White House leading up to January 6th about, you know, sort of challenging these results because of some of the sketchy dealings. Now, again, I want to give context here because a lot of people hate this guy now because they're saying he colluded with the administration to overturn the results. And if you look at the texts that were unveiled, he basically pressed Mark Meadows saying, we need to find evidence now to present. And then when there was no evidence, hard evidence they could do, he backed away. And to me, that is the most reasonable thing you could claim, right? To say, you know, it's like, if I'm going to go in and and I think I have a very strong suspicion that, you know, Brit has been replaced by an alien, and I want to make sure that I call him out before our next cringe post recording, and I'm working with his wife, and I text her, like, we need evidence that Brit has in fact been replaced by an alien, and then we have no evidence. Of course I'm going to back down from it. And if Brit had been replaced by an alien, you'd absolutely want me to call it out. But anyway, so they're acting like this is some big smoking gun. So in light of that, Evan McMullin, who is the independent who ran for the presidency, and he was just some random nobody who thought he was a former Republican trying to run, and everyone's like, wow, he's going to be a big deal, and he just wasn't. He got very insignificant margins in the polls. He's from Utah, former CIA operative. Anyway, so he's running against Mike Lee as an independent. Now, so within that, Evan McMullin tweets, today we took an important step in building a new coalition of Democrats, Republicans, and independents to change our broken politics. I'm grateful for the support of Democratic delegates who voted to join us and Kale Weston's honorable campaign. Onward. So the Democrats in Utah are not running a candidate, and they are endorsing Evan McMullin to try to beat Mike Lee. And Ken Harbaugh, I think Harbaugh, not sure how that's pronounced. He's like a podcaster and opinion writer, writes, I might not agree with Evan McMullin on everything, but we agree on protecting democracy and holding insurrectionists accountable. Proud of my fellow Democrats in Utah. This is what country over party looks like. Let's go. And the last thing I want to point out, I know I've given a lot of preamble to this, but the last thing I want to point out is that Andrew Yang retweeted this, and Andrew Yang has been writing these articles and recording these videos talking about how this is the most interesting race and how this is great for his new Forward Party, which is all about upsetting the duopoly. But to me, it's so funny that Andrew Yang is so obsessed that with this particular race that he would rather support a CIA operative, a neocon Republican CIA operative, over the other guy in the name of nonpartisanship, which is really just partisanship, right? It's like, oh, he's an independent, therefore I'm going all in on him, which is just being partisan by any other name. Because it upsets the duopoly, you're like choosing the third best choice, which was also my complaint with the Libertarian Party messaging in 2020, where they're like, there's a third choice. And you're like, you don't want to make it sound like there's just three choices. You want to say your ideas are important. Your ideas matter. But to them, it's all about, oh, we can just upset the duopoly with this CIA operative. Like, that's the person you're running? The guy who is in charge of operations that are extra constitutional, killing brown people overseas? Like, my goodness.
Yeah, what people don't understand about politics is that there really isn't a two-party system. There's just the establishment, right? And then the people. That's essentially what it comes down to. And so what really got me was Ken Harbaugh's last line, which is, this is what country over party looks like. And so many of these people, when they're talking about democracy and faith to the country and being a patriot and all these things, what they're really talking about is that we want to uphold the established order that we've had for the past 40 years. And the one... It's like upsetting the duopoly, that as they call it, just for the sake of doing it, is like that's really not compelling, right, in any shape or form. And for them, in this, it's obviously, as I like to call him, Evan McMuffin. He's just an establishment guy. Like you're saying, he's a CIA agent. He parrots all of the establishment talking points about everything, as can be seen about this January 6th opinion. And it's just unfortunate, that like Andrew Yang, who I thought was like, okay, like this guy actually, like, one of the things I appreciate about him in the debates was like, at least he like kind of fleshed out his ideas, right? Or he had a little bit different perspective, which was kind of cool. And then one of my favorite line was when they were talking about global warming. And he's like, it's too late. If this is true, we need to head to higher ground. I was like, oh, that's really refreshing, for someone if what you're saying is true, what Greta Thunberg is saying is true, like it's already too late and you just need to start building a house, up on the mountain, not on the ocean side like Barack Obama. Yeah. But I don't know, man. Maybe like, did you play Cyberpunk?
I didn't. No, I did not.
Oh, okay. Well, if you ever do, there's this side quest where you're like tasked with bodyguarding a politician, and it turns out that they've got like this, like the establishment has this like hidden room in his house where they're changing his brainwaves to like think like the establishment. And like, I think that honestly, it's like whenever these guys kind of get into power or they get into some stage of influence, like Andrew Yang, Donald Trump, any of them, like, it's almost like they change, and or maybe they were that way the entire time. But it's so weird that everything that these guys say always they do the opposite once they get into office. Like Barack Obama ran on a platform that honestly sounded pretty good, right? From our perspective as libertarians, like, hey, we need to end the wars, we need to do all this different stuff. And then he gets in and it's like proceeds to bomb 7 countries and enter wars, with more countries than we've ever been at war with at a single time. And it's just really weird to me, and go for it.
It speaks to say something that Trump's unfinished promise of building a wall still is more complete than Barack Obama's campaign promise of closing Guantanamo Bay.
Yes.
And before that, think about Candidate Bush. Candidate Bush sounds almost like a Rand Paul now, right? Where he's like, we don't want to be the policeman of the world. He was talking about non-interventionism and small government.
Yeah.
So you're not wrong there at all. When you're talking, upsetting the duopoly for its own sake, it's like, cool, yeah, we did that, back in when we got rid of the Whigs. Cool, we have a duopoly again. Replacing one party for another, if the ideas are no different, who cares?
And it's funny is they all vote the same, right? Like when it comes down to it, all these guys will have some sort of you can tell a bill is really bad when there's consensus among the Democrats and the Republicans. It's going to screw everyone over when that happens. I mean, just look at the they're trying to blame the inflation on Putin right now, but it's like the inflation we're experiencing right now was a bipartisan CARES Act bill, right? Like both parties voted yes on it. And here we are today, with gas costing upwards of $5 a gallon, and the groceries. When I go to Costco, I fill up half a cart, and I'm spending $250. Like, yeah, that sucks, man. Like that, and guess both parties voted on that. It's not like it was just Democrats or Republicans. But when it comes down to spending money or getting money from bombing other countries, like you can pretty much guarantee that the duopoly, as they call it, will agree on it.
Yeah, and just Evan McMullin is gonna flop. I just see no path for him forward, and everyone's trying to play this up like it's a big important thing. When you have a CIA operative running in Utah against a very conservative, guy like Mike Lee in a state that went plus 21 for Trump, and then Evan McMullin comes out in favor of gun control bills, you're like, okay, yeah, well, this is not a story.
Wow.
So
yeah, they want to try and pull the Trump, right? Which is like, ooh, this third party person comes in and disrupts it all. But it's like, no, the reason Trump disrupted it all was because he was saying things that no one else was saying, right? But everyone thought. And so, yeah, Evan McMuffin is not going to be able to actually do anything because he's saying all the same he's a Democrat, right? Essentially in this race. At least that's how he'll be perceived, is that he's saying all the same stuff that a Democrat says.
Yeah, I can't think of anything notably different from him and like Chuck Schumer, really. Like, very establishment, pro-war, I mean, it's just such a bad look for a CIA operative to be like, yeah, we should bomb overseas, but you shouldn't have a gun to defend yourself. Yike. Okay. All right. Here's that famous promised tweet from Joe Walsh, who tweets, I find Elon Musk to be a thoroughly uninteresting person.
He should have been aborted.
Dude, this tweet reeks of the kid at a party who just tells everyone, I don't care. Or like, I don't want to do the thing everyone's excited and happy about. I don't care. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. Oh, what did you think about the new movie? Oh, I didn't like it. Well, did you see it? No, I don't care about it. I just didn't go see it. It's like you're not even Joe Walsh is not even interesting himself enough to find critiques of Elon Musk that are nuanced and interesting. He's just saying, no, I just find him uninteresting. Again, like the Steve Jobs post, of all the things to pick and all the people to pick to find to be uninteresting, Elon Musk is the wrong person and uninteresting is the wrong adjective.
Yeah, my favorite retweet that I saw of this was, I can't remember who did it, but they were basically like, this is coming from the least interesting Joe Walsh.
Yeah.
You got Joe Walsh, the musician, and yeah, all that stuff. He said thoroughly uninteresting too. It's like you were saying, it's the kid at the party that, to be cool, is like has an apathetic persona. And as Reliant K says, being apathetic is a pathetic way to be. And Joe Walsh is definitely pathetic. Like you think about Elon Musk, he's anything but uninteresting, right? Like he made his initial wealth off of revolutionizing the payment industry with PayPal. A lot of people don't know that he was one of the original co-founders of PayPal, which made
Thiel.
things. And which made all sorts of e-commerce basically possible with like eBay and all this stuff, which has just revolutionized how we do business. And then instead of I think he sold it for like $250 million or something like that. And instead of him basically sitting back and enjoying a rich life with that much money, he's like, nope, I'm going to double down. I'm going to go all in on electric vehicles. So he put it all into Tesla, almost went bankrupt, was literally sleeping on the factory floor trying to make things happen, but made it happen. Now Tesla's one of the biggest companies in the world, and then also doubled down on SpaceX, the boring company, which is not boring like in the BORE kind of way, but in the like the drill through holes through the the center of the earth kind of way. And he's trying to send people to space and to Mars and stuff. Like I think of all the billionaires, like he is the least like uninteresting, if that makes sense. Like I could see why you could call maybe Warren Buffett. Like, oh, Warren Buffett's not that interesting, right? Like he's kind of a rich guy who's really frugal that lives in the same house for the past 30 years and like just makes tons of money on conservative investments, right? Like I would love to talk with him. People spend a lot of money to talk with him, but I could see how he's kind of uninteresting. But like Elon Musk is like real life Iron Man. Like I don't know how you could get more interesting than that.
There's so many things that you could say that you don't like about him. Maybe I would or wouldn't disagree. I mean, there are problems with Elon Musk for sure. Joe Walsh could have said, Elon Musk is cringy. I don't like the jokes he makes on Twitter. You could say Elon Musk is irresponsible because of the way that he recklessly uses money or tweets or things like that. You could say Elon Musk is a hypocrite because of some of the government regulations and things that he takes advantage of while preaching against it. You could say that Elon Musk is exploitative because maybe you just want to critique the idea of billionaires and the ways that he's tried to shut down unions or things like that. Just right now, I can list 4 things that are critiques of Elon Musk that make him more interesting than Joe Walsh. The critiques that I don't even disagree, or that I don't even agree with necessarily, some of them I may or may not, but those things make him more interesting than you will ever be, Joe Walsh, because the only thing that's notable about you is that you are a bigger hypocrite than Elon Musk is. That's your interesting trait. That's what makes you fascinating, is that you went from being a loud, brash Trump supporter type to denouncing it when it became publicly popular to do so. Wow. That's not, a tale as old as time. Good grief. The amount of it's almost arrogance, but it almost reeks more of jealousy in some respects too. And I don't know that he even is aware of it, but I get the feeling that Joe Walsh feels this. And this is entirely projection, so take this for what you will. But it feels like on the one hand, he feels this self-righteousness and smugness of being in the right crowds who have the right opinions and get the retweets on Twitter because from the corporate blue checks. You get that. And then also deeply unsatisfied because someone like Elon Musk can set the world ablaze, or someone like Donald Trump, who he hates, can get the world ablaze by a single tweet. And Joe Walsh, his biggest achievement is running for president against Trump and getting absolutely smothered. And
I didn't even know he ran against Trump for president.
The funny thing is, amongst
cool he was.
all the people who ran against Trump in the 2020 primary, I think Joe Walsh is also the least interesting of those. Mark Sanford is the other one who comes to mind. I think there was one other, and I can't remember them, but. So good job, Joe Walsh. You're actually slightly more memorable than someone.
It makes me think of like the kind of just how the educational or artist class has always hated and despised the merchant class, right? Because like the educators and the artists always think that they should make more money, or they're not valued as much as the merchant class. And it's like, so someone like Joe Walsh, right, who spent his whole life basically in like some sort of public sector job, whether it was fundraising or as a congressperson or whatever, absolutely hates the fact that Elon Musk, who doesn't have a master's degree, has made billions of dollars and more people care about who he is Even on just the factor of like how many people Elon Musk employs, like I'm sure that's magnitudes larger than the amount of people that care about Joe Walsh, right? Because Joe Walsh has done nothing of value for the world other than be a leech and take money from the public sector and from the people, and then use it how he deems fit. So that's kind of the reason why, like, it's really disturbing when you start realizing, like, oh, people like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or AOC, all these folks, like, they just hate the people that actually make the world happen, right? And it's like, you got to start wondering why, they hate these people that make the world happen when they live so, high and touty lives from the fruits of the labor of these people that make the world better. There's so much stuff that Joe Walsh has reaped the benefits of people like Elon Musk, yet he still hates them, and it's really, or at least he finds them uninteresting. I guess he didn't say he hated them. It's like, man, I'd be pretty interested in my life being better and the people that are responsible for my life being better.
Yeah, I just don't think. I just don't think at the end of the day, Joe Walsh actually finds Elon Musk to be thoroughly uninteresting, because things that you find thoroughly uninteresting, you generally don't tweet about.
Yeah.
Which is why, for instance, I didn't bother tweeting about like the, 50th Call of Duty game release that's happened.
I didn't know they just had one.
Yeah, I think they did. Maybe they do. I don't know. I don't even know. But that's the thing. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying
you're just not interested
to me.
Yeah, I find it pretty uninteresting too.
Okay. And this next tweet reads, I've been asking this for 2 years, but still, why not take every simple precaution to better protect yourself and others from COVID-19? Almost seems too easy of an ask. I really don't care about, quote, the principle, unquote, when I'm told I have to do what I'm already doing as a good citizen. So here we have, for our second week in a row, this absolute outing of yourself to say, I don't care about principles. It's apparent. And there's a few different things about this one, but the first thing that strikes me is, why not take every simple precaution? Well, if you're taking every simple precaution, that means you wouldn't leave your house, because that's a pretty simple precaution, right? It's not a reasonable precaution, but it is a simple precaution. So then he would say, well, you don't have to be that extreme. And it's like, okay, well then where are we going to draw the line here? Because if we're talking about every simple precaution, well, we know that masks don't work unless you're wearing an N95. That N95 needs to be absolutely glued to your face. And, you can't take that off in any public space. So is that still a simple precaution, or is that extreme? Because if you're asking people to wear masks that are not effective, you're not taking every simple precaution. So you need to have and this is why he doesn't care about principles. Because if he wanted to live by his own principles, he would be living, and he would be wanting everyone else to be required to live in a much more cumbersome way than even the current regulations were, or not current, but the regulations at their height were. Even in the most draconian of the lockdown rules and COVID, we weren't actually required to do the most effective mitigating factors, because lockdowns were not effective and masking mandates were not effective, and the only times they were N95s. There've never been policies that required N95s. So if you're talking about every simple precaution, then you don't get to pick and choose what that means. That means you stay in your house, like the lockdown suggested, which were proved to be inefficient. But if it's every simple precaution, that's a simple precaution. If it's not every simple precaution, and it's only the ones that are proven to be effective, then you can't demand everyone to wear ineffective masks, and you would have to only go out in public wearing an N95, never once adjusting it or taking it off, even to take a bite of food.
The thing that really got me and still gets me about anyone that kind of makes these points is like, well, I just want to be safe. Like, I want to take the right precautions. Like, if I can protect my neighbor, why would I not do that? And it's like, okay, like, just to steel man the argument, like, I agree with you. Like, if I could protect my neighbor by going outside and wearing a mask or whatever, because we had airborne Ebola, it's like, yeah, I would do that, right? Like, if I knew that was the truth. And in the beginning, even though masks weren't mandated, I still wore a mask for a little bit because I wasn't really sure what was going on, right? Like I wanted to see the data, and everyone had told me this big scary virus has landed from China and it's going to kill 50% of everyone unless we do this and do that. I was like, okay, I'm going to wear the mask, right? Like I'm going to make sure, and I'm going to not go to work if I'm feeling sick and all these different things. The problem is it was all a lie, right? None of it, and we knew it was a lie about 6 months into the pandemic. And so for at least a year and a half, as this guy's been asking for the past 2 years, we've known what works and what doesn't work based off of the data. And it's like, okay, like what if Fauci came out, and I think you've used this example, like every morning you've got to come out of your house and you have to wear, a hat in the shape of a banana on your head. And you've got to wear that around all day whenever you're in public around anyone. And that's going to protect you from COVID-19. Like, it's like, oh, that's obviously a lie, right? Like that's not actually true. It doesn't actually work. And so the principle of the simple precaution is a totally false premise because it's actually not a precaution in the first place. And so now you have to start asking yourself, like, hey, like, is it important for me to do things that work, or is it important for me to do, or is it important for me to, make sure I'm, like I was saying, I'm kind of stumbling around. Important for me to do things that work, or is it important for me to feel like I'm doing what the authorities are telling me to do? And a lot of these people fall into that second category. They want to feel like, oh, I obeyed the rules, so I'm going to be fine. Like, it reminded me, I was on the plane this past weekend, and like, this guy I saw in front of me, like I was flying back to the U.S. and he was wearing a mask to get onto the plane, and then on the flight attendants and everyone said, "Hey, you don't have to wear a mask. It's not allowed. You don't have to do it on here. It's not mandated." So he took it off, and then when we were getting off, he proceeded to do the whole flight with the mask off, and then when we landed in Seattle, he proceeded to put the mask back on as we were getting off the plane. It's like, this is so weird, that like you're not thinking through the actual implications of your actions, right? Like as our past cringe post talked about, like it's not caring to do something that's ineffective.
Yeah, when you're talking about the divide of, this doing something to be perceived as because the authorities tell you to and you want to be under that's what he says at the end here, right? I really don't care about the principle when I'm told I have to do what I'm already doing as a good citizen. It's like he's like, I don't care about principles when it comes down to it, because I'm already checked under this good boy box of, following the rules. So like, I don't really care the principle of you telling me what to do or whatnot. I don't care about the principle of it being mandated when I'm already doing that thing. It's such a selfish kind of way of thinking in essence.
He must not believe in democracy.
Right. Well, it's like they think they're being generous because, oh, I just want to protect, all these other people. But actually what you're saying is you don't care about the principle of other people being told what to do and under the threat of force, because it condones, or what is being told agrees with what you think right now, which of course is only being told to you by the same people who are enforcing that everyone do it. So there's the obvious conflict of interest there. But this is kind of reminiscent in a little tangential way of something we've talked about before, where a lot of people in my friend group, or at least in the demographics that I was in, who either were students or worked from home or whatever, and have like gaming as a hobby, or not super outdoorsy, or don't like to travel. They were like, honestly, COVID was kind of fine for me. Like, the lockdowns and stuff. I got to play a lot of video games. I got to connect with online friends a lot more. And I don't want to hurt. I get that, but it's also like, and the people that I knew that said this always had added the caveat of like, it doesn't make the lockdowns right, and like that's not okay still. But I saw people with that sentiment who didn't add that caveat. People are just saying like, I don't know, COVID actually let all these things thrive. Or you'd see the articles about the Twitch,
the world is healing.
Yeah. The Twitch streaming thing has boomed, and all these great things that have come of it. And it's like, remember that there's this real cost into telling people what they can and can't do. And there are people who are not like you, who don't enjoy spending time at home, who like to be able to go out and about and stuff like, even just from even as I am predisposed to liking those things because I'm somewhat of a homebody. I like gaming. I'm not a super go out and party kind of person. Even I was really put off by this because like at the time I was dating my now wife, and it's like, great, we can't like go out and go on dates in cool places anymore because of these stupid lockdowns. So there's so many ways in which thinking about I don't care about the principle when the principle of being forced to do something because I'm already doing it. That's inherently so selfish. But these people do it all under the veneer of being generous because it's just to protect your neighbor when that's really not the case at all, as any data will point you to.
Yeah, and then my last thing on it, but like these same people will hype up like, oh, I'm a protector of democracy. Well, it's like, okay, democracy only works when you believe that all of the like democracy is the belief that the best result comes from all the people having their voice shared. So inherently, you have to believe that majority of people are good and have the best interest of everyone else at heart. So it's like, if you're already a good citizen and you believe that everyone's good citizens, then wouldn't everyone already be doing this without any sort of mandate? And if not, then that means that you have to have a minority, a fascist government, push down a mandate on everyone else to make the right thing happen. So like this guy is just admitting, if I'm going to infer, his fascist tendencies and leanings.
Right. And in order for that to work, you also have to allow there to be the expression of dissent to be able to determine what is or isn't the majority, right?
Yes.
So you need to allow people to say things like Alex Berenson did, where this doesn't make sense, or go into public places without a mask because it doesn't work.
That's a great point.
Otherwise, you're just stifling and tampering with the democracy, and you're the real insurrectionist. Okay. Our next tweet comes as a quote. Let's see, a response to a quote tweet. So the original tweet that is incepted here is Rebecca Parson for Congress, who tweets, $15 minimum wage is an antiquated demand. It should be $30 per hour. And someone in the Liberty space quote tweets that saying, $15 minimum wage is an antiquated demand. It should be $0 per hour. And a reply to that tweet reads, jokes aside, the concept of a $0 an hour minimum wage is stupid. No one is going to accept a $0 an hour salary, so it points to write that into law. What you want is wages to be set by the market. Okay. Oh, this is so dumb.
It's that liberty autism there for you.
Yeah, it's like, okay, like that's not what actually people. The point, the biggest point is that there is a $0 an hour minimum wage. It's called being born into this life and not having any kind of a job. When you live and when you struggle to survive, you get a $0 an hour minimum wage. You literally, what you earn is what you do and make. You set your own hours. You're guaranteed nothing. If you find, I don't know, $50 worth of food, if you're going to sort of carry that ratio over in the forest, that's your minimum wage for that day. And then tomorrow, you're not guaranteed anything. You get $0 an hour unless you work and give yourself some sort of value mechanism there. So that's kind of the bigger point I feel like that's being made in the original thing is like $0 an hour should be what is legislated and required, not. And so this person is saying no one would accept it. And it's like, well, one, even if that were true, it doesn't matter if you accept it or not. When you get fired, that's your wage. You don't have to accept that you got fired. I guess you don't have to accept that, but it's the reality regardless.
Yes. I love the original tweet from Rebecca Parson, I think she's running in Washington, actually. And I remember back when SeaTac was doing the $12 an hour minimum wage or whatever it was. And everyone was like, well, if we do $12 an hour, it's going to eventually creep up to $15 and then $20 and then $30. And then everyone's like, no, it won't. Like $12 is a living wage. And it's like, boom, here we go. Someone that is running for Congress is saying, well, if 15 is the minimum wage, why not double it to 30? And it's like the age-old meme of like, why not $1,000 an hour comes true, right? Like we're not that far away from that. Like if you're literally doubling it every 2 years, you're going to be at $1,000 an hour in a couple years. And obviously everyone knows that's absurd. And so just kind of scale that back a little bit and you realize that like, oh yeah, even $15 an hour is pretty crazy. This person that talks about like, oh, we shouldn't legislate a $0 minimum wage. Like this person is of our persuasion, right? Like, and that's kind of like the classic joke. Like us libertarians, like we kind of get autistic about like little details of these things, and this is very much in that vein, right? But he or she or whoever this is overlooks the fact that like there are plenty of people that do work for $0 an hour. Like a self-made business owner usually works for $0 or negative dollars an hour for the first 3 years of their business. There are plenty of interns that want to work at really nice different firms, or are trying to apprentice in a different type of industry that will work for $0 an hour in exchange for the experience and the credentials and the resume credentials that they want. So there's not, and that's kind of like the overarching point, right? Is that like if you're setting a minimum wage, you're denying the fact that there are other values in working that could be a part of whether you take one job or the other. If I got a job for $0 an hour or as an intern at some really prestigious tech company, and I directly interfaced with the CEO every single day, and I learned the ins and outs of this industry, like that's when I go to apply for another job, that experience might be worth an extra $40,000 on my paycheck, right? Because I have it. And so it's like you can't really quantify all these other different, things that you have. And when you say like I'm going to have a minimum wage, basically you're saying none of that matters, right? And that's that screws the market over, and it screws people over. Go for it.
It's not even that you can't quantify it necessarily on an individual case. It's that you can't quantify it equally for what the minimum value of something should be. Because it's like, like you said, like maybe that discussion that you had with the CEO is worth $40,000, and you could specifically quantify that.
Sure.
But that also is something that's entirely different than me getting an internship for a local newspaper firm where I still want that experience, but it's not worth $40,000. So where do you set that minimum what's the minimum amount that it can be worth? And the point that you're making there is that it can't be equal across everything. There should be no minimum baseline because everything is in flux and differently valued. When you were talking about like the first initial claim, and you're talking about like why not $1,000, just to follow up on that really quick, the bigger the broader point that is I think a lot of people, to steelman it, would say, well, you need it to keep pace with the standard of living. But the problem is that the dollar amount, and as can be seen in the principle of keeping asking, well, why not $1,000? Why not $2,000? Is that if you don't have an actual point of reference that your dollar value is signifying, like a certain level of work or whatever, essentially amount of value that is being created. If you're not tying that to anything other than just this is the minimum wage, the problem is then your inflation just gets out of hand because the minimum wage value doesn't change, just the dollar amount attached to it does. So the reason why we ask why not 1,000, why not 2,000 isn't to say that there's no difference between $1,000 and $30 right now, but it's to say that you have to tie that $30, if that's what you want the minimum wage to be, to an amount of work. And if you're not tying that to an amount of work, then eventually you get to $1,000 anyway, and everything else in prices does as well. So yeah, I think sometimes people get confused when you ask that question because they're like, well, obviously because $80 is more than 30, and with $30, you can at least afford these things. With 80, you can afford more that you don't need or whatever. But the point isn't so much that we don't see the difference between a minimum of 30 and 1,000 in present day. The point is that you don't have anything that you're specifically affixing the value to. And when you increase that value, everything else goes up anyway. So you can't keep it. You can't try to say the minimum wage is going to be worth whatever the standard of living adjusted rate is, because then that will literally keep sliding up because the amount of value that a minimum wage job is will remain stagnant in most cases. The only thing that makes a minimum wage job worth more is market forces making them more productive. Things like operating a machine that replicates the work that one person can do to equal what 100 people could do. That is what actually moves wages up. That is what actually creates more value and creates cheaper products and lets the lower earners in society have access to the things that the higher earners had access to before. That's the only thing where you can move that, is by actually creating more value and creating things that let others produce more value, not artificially changing some dollar amount. That's never going to actually create more value. And that's kind of the point here with the original minimum wage take.
And that's yes. And that's why like people always talk about like, well, why are tech people paid so much money, right? Like why is an engineer at Amazon, or Facebook paid so much money? And it's because all they do is sit at a computer at their home and they write code. Like how is that compared to someone who works at a meat processing factory? Well, it's like the engineer at Facebook will write code and billions of people will use that code to do different types of things, and if that affects billions of other people, right? Like that single person's expertise and skill cascades across literally the whole world, whereas the meat processor's value is capped at how much meat they can process per hour. Like you were saying, if that meat processor could process 1 billion people's worth of meat in an hour, they'd be paid a lot of money. You'd be sitting really well and pretty if you could do that. But that's just not, like you're saying, the more you innovate and automate that industry or enhance how much people can actually produce, the more they are going to, more money they're going to take home because they're producing more value. They're contributing more to the team.
Exactly right. Okay, our last post of the day comes from Reddit, and the original post is this picture that says, "They always have money for wars, but can't feed the poor," and shows a picture of military jets and then a homeless person on the street. And just to start out with, I think this is a little bit of apples and oranges. As much as I sympathize, like we spend way too much on the military, to think that then government spending being redirected into like homelessness can fix that problem is really naive and not accurate either. But at the very least, I agree that the military budget is bad and should not be as much as it is. That being said, our social spending is also way, way, way higher. And if there was going to be a government fix for it, we would have fixed it because of the amount of money we spend on these kinds of services. Regardless, that's not the post we're here to critique. The critique is a reply that reads, "Feed all the poor, stop funding the army so we can all die because there's no army to defend us. Good logic, retardo." There's nothing like someone being so confidently wrong and like throwing in like that, like at the end. Chef's kiss. So, I love this idea that there's any level of sort of conservative to libertarian, even lefty laughing at this. You can just pin the dial anywhere and you can still laugh at this take, because it's like, even if you think we need to have a very big, strong military, to think that all of our military spending is necessary, that's not a very conservative principle. I think most conservatives nowadays would even agree, and they definitely would have historically, but before the neocon takeover, that the U.S. military budget has ballooned and there's a lot of inefficiencies, and big government is bad and bureaucratic, even if it is the military, which for some reason kind of got lost in the 2000s here. But also the idea that it's like, let's pretend, we reduce military spending. Oh man, we're just going to get land invasions left and right, and we're not going to be able to fend them off, and we're all going to die. Like, talk about hysteria. Talk about just goofy, sort of cartoonish geopolitical thinking. It's just so funny.
Well, this person obviously just like they're one of those folks that thinks that history started on 9/11, and it's like, oh my gosh, if we don't spend almost $1 trillion a year on the military, like we're gonna have a 9/11 every week. And it's like, oh dude, like you got to look back and realize that 9/11 and all these different things, like the U.S. is the empire in terms of, like, if this is a Star Wars analogy, we are the ones sending our soldiers into other countries to kill and persecute the innocents. It's not the other way around. There's very little threat to us here on our homeland. We are the ones that export violence all across the world. And by exporting that violence all across the world, in turn, it actually makes us less safe, right? We invite people to be radicalized and to do the things that like they did on 9/11. And I'm not justifying what happened on 9/11. That's an awful thing, and no one should do anything like that. But it is understandable, right? Like you just have to look up like the massacre at Kana. Like we literally slaughtered kids in hospitals with our missiles. We've literally slaughtered hundreds of thousands of children through embargoes, by starving them in Iraq, all these different things. And you radicalized a whole generation, right, by exporting our military strength, and making us, making the world safer, so that we're fighting the wars over there instead of fighting them here back at home. We radicalized a whole generation of men and people that are bitter towards us, and understandably so, because we've killed their families and ruined their countries and gone. The thought of like. And this is maybe a future cringe post for myself, but the thought that we could export democracy to a place like Afghanistan or in Iraq or anywhere like that is just absurd. And we all know that now. At least I hope we all know that now. That was never going to happen. And I think the people that were talking about doing that knew that couldn't happen, but they just really wanted to do the violence over there. So. This guy is kind of like the useful idiot that the war machine uses to get more budget allocated for them to build bombs and planes and aircraft carriers.
Yeah, and at the very least, you have to basically raise an entire country and destroy the population living there to rebuild it from the ground up if you want to implement something like democracy and hold it there by force. It's kind of like the U.S. occupation of Japan for so many years after we nuke it. And then you force this democracy that's more or less successful and very corrupt and very problematic, even now, as you think of Japan as the civilized thing. And to think, okay, so even if you're in support of democracy, do you think that you're the good guy when it means bombing a nation and literally murdering innocents and forcing them to comply? That's not democratic. It's like you have to break the tenets of democracy in order to establish the democracy, which is just so funny.
Yeah.
But something else I kind of want to point out, and this is kind of tangential and ranty of me, but when you're talking about the whole 9/11 and the way that we've sort of brought this blowback on ourselves, it's so comparable to Ukraine in the way that you specifically said not that it justifies 9/11, but it would not have happened had we not been messing and bombing their children and stuff like that, messing around. And that makes me think of when Tulsi Gabbard was talking with the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine. And she said this simply would not have happened if we had given them a firm declaration that Ukraine would not join NATO. And people lost their freaking minds calling her a Russian apologist. People I like, people who are reasonable people even of the liberty persuasion, were talking about how she's just repeating Putin talking points and how she's catering. And I'm like, she's not justifying anything Putin has done. In the exact same way that you're saying 9/11 was not justified, but the rationale, it wouldn't have happened had we not done this thing. That's and people were getting all upset, like she was saying that what Putin did was reasonable and fine, and that she was defending his actions. And I'm like, no, it's in the exact same way that you don't, if you're arguing with a friend and you choose to take the left path versus the right, and there's a collapsed tunnel on the left path and you're delayed for an hour, and you say, this wouldn't have happened if we'd gone down the right path. You're not saying that the tunnel collapsing was a good thing. You're not saying the tunnel collapsing was your friend's fault. You're just saying, or your fault. You're just saying it wouldn't have happened. Your delay wouldn't have happened if you'd gone down that path. And that's what history is repeating itself when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, because it's like, if you merely mention the fact, and whether or not you think she's right, whether or not you think Putin would have still invaded based on NATO saying Ukraine will not join us or whatever, the point is that she should be allowed to speak that opinion without being accused of being a Putin apologist or defending what he did. And so that kind of binary thinking has seeped into everything, and that's what it was during 9/11. And I think nowadays it's a lot safer to say things like 9/11 would not have happened if we hadn't been bombing their countries, and that doesn't justify 9/11, but that's why it happened. That's a lot safer than it was. but now it's just Ukraine. And so you have people like this who think you stop paying this inflated US military a single dime and we're going to all die. And then also that we need to spend every dollar to go defend Ukraine. And if you dare question anything about the military, if you dare question anything about what would or would not have had the effects, caused these effects, like Russia invading Ukraine, then you're a Russian apologist, and you don't want the U.S. to be prosperous and free.
Yeah, it's like I was having this conversation with someone else about it, and they're from Ukraine, and they're like, well, you sound like you just don't care about the people in Ukraine. It's like, no, I think I care more than you, because I want to make sure that what got Ukraine into the situation doesn't actually happen again, right? Like if we just, like you were saying, like Tulsi was saying, if we just give them, hey, we're not going to let them join NATO, and hey, we're also not going to ship them a bunch of arms, and hey, we're not going to overthrow their democratically elected government by using a Nazi-backed battalion. We probably would have avoided this, right? Like Putin wouldn't feel the need to go invade there, and like we've all been saying and keep giving this caveat, he's not justified in the slaughter of innocents by any means. And like you and I both think, I think Putin should be put on trial for war crimes, along with Barack Obama and Trump and Biden and basically every president that has ever existed, with maybe the exception of like Calvin Coolidge, who you and I both very much like. But they should all be put on trial for war crimes, and they're all awful, right? That doesn't change the fact that what we have done in Ukraine has caused. It's all awful, but what we have done in Ukraine has caused this to happen, right? Like, what is it? It's the there's those different types of like foreign political philosophies, which is like the realist, right? Which is like, it's like there are actual, like, regardless of what principle you hold, like certain actions have certain responses happen back to them, right? And by us shipping arms into Ukraine, by overthrowing their government, all these things, this is the reaction we could probably hypothesize was going to happen. And a lot of people have been saying is going to happen for a long time. So if you actually care about Ukraine, if you actually care about the people that died at 9/11, maybe we should stop doing the things that caused that to happen in the first place.
Completely agree. Last sort of potpourri of things I want to add in, just to give context to the whole Russia-Ukraine thing, since we brought it up. One is, I think with the NATO-Ukraine thing, it's like, would have been so easy for the U.S. to say, or NATO to say, we will not let Ukraine in NATO unless you invade. If you invade Ukraine, then we would consider it. That's a very clear line where everyone kind of gets where they want. Ukraine doesn't get invaded, or if they do, then Putin risks people joining NATO. I mean, that's kind of the irony with, like, I think it's Sweden and Finland that now want to join NATO, and they're applying for it. He's caused more people to join. So if at the outset you'd said, look, we won't let Ukraine into NATO as long as you don't invade. And if you invade, then it's on the table. You know what I mean? Then at least you can call out Putin's bluff. But now we didn't do that. We didn't even try to avert that. Second thing, when you bring up the Nazi battalion, a lot of people are confused, but because Zelensky is a Jew, right? And he's the president of Ukraine. You're like, why would he still be employing a Nazi battalion? That seems like it's just propaganda. And here's the reason why. When the Nazis are talked about in the Eastern Bloc over there, while they did target Jews, it's taught a lot more, especially in Russia, about the Russian citizens that were killed and that were, the Nazis fighting Russia on their turf and stuff like that. And so the link that we have with the Holocaust and Jews in the U.S. is not as strong over there. Whereas, from Putin's perspective, he can say, we want to denazify this place, and all of the Russian citizens, at least, that or people allegedly would be able to say, yeah, that makes sense, we agree. And it would seem right that their foe in the Ukraine has a Nazi battalion because they're going against Russia's soldiers, and there's a clash there. And that makes sense to them, which is just one of those kind of weird little things. They don't have the Jewish connection as strongly, I believe, as others. So those were just two random little things I wanted to throw in.
That's good.
Not particularly relevant to the Cringe Post, but important to the context of the conversation. So with that, we will close off this episode. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, if you can leave us a like, a subscription, 5-star rating on all those podcasting platforms, we really appreciate it. And we will catch you on the next one.